You wake before the sun has fully climbed above the horizon. The air is sharp enough to sting your lungs, and every breath hangs briefly in front of your face before disappearing into the pale morning light. Somewhere beyond the mist, a child begins to cry. Dry grass rustles beneath cautious footsteps, while the distant calls of unfamiliar birds echo across a landscape that no one in your family has ever seen before. Behind you lies a world that has slowly become impossible to survive. Ahead stretches thousands of miles of uncertainty. No map exists. No road points the way. Yet somehow, you take the next step. For a long time, the story of human migration sounded almost impossible. How could small bands of hunter-gatherers, carrying little more than stone tools, animal skins, and memories, spread across nearly every corner of the planet? It may not have been extraordinary strength or remarkable luck alone that made this journey possible. Archaeological evidence suggests that curiosity, adaptability, and countless small decisions repeated across thousands of generations could have shaped one of the greatest adventures in human history. When people imagine ancient migration, they often picture determined explorers setting out with a destination already in mind. It is an appealing image. A courageous group gathers its belongings, points toward the horizon, and begins a deliberate expedition into the unknown. But archaeology paints a far more subtle picture. The first great migrations may have unfolded so gradually that no individual ever realized they were part of an event that would reshape the entire world. The story begins in Africa, the birthplace of our species. Fossil discoveries from sites such as Jebel Irhoud in Morocco and Homo in Ethiopia, together with genetic evidence collected from living populations around the world, indicate that Homo sapiens evolved in Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago. Yet for an astonishingly long time, our ancestors remained within this vast continent. Africa itself was not a single environment, but an immense mosaic of deserts, forests, mountains, grasslands, wetlands, and coastlines. Learning to survive in these dramatically different landscapes may have been the first great lesson that prepared humans for a much larger journey. Life was rarely predictable. Climate shifted repeatedly. Rainfall patterns changed over centuries. Rivers that once nourished thriving ecosystems could gradually disappear, while dry valleys unexpectedly filled with water after wetter periods returned. Entire regions transformed within the span of many generations. To survive, humans could not rely on instinct alone. They needed to observe, remember, communicate, and adapt. This ability may have become our greatest evolutionary advantage. Unlike many other animals that specialize in a narrow ecological niche, humans learned to become specialists in flexibility itself. One generation discovered edible roots during droughts. Another learned which stones fractured into sharper blades. Children inherited not only genes, but knowledge. Every successful hunt, every dangerous mistake, every new campsite became information that could be passed forward through stories and shared experience. That cultural inheritance changed everything. A lion cub must largely rediscover the world on its own. A human child enters a world already filled with accumulated wisdom stretching back countless generations. Fire no longer needs to be reinvented. Toolmaking does not begin from nothing. Dangerous plants already have names. Safe water sources are remembered. Migration itself becomes easier because each generation starts where the previous one ended. Yet knowledge alone could not solve every problem. Climate continued to challenge our ancestors in ways they could never fully control. During the Pleistocene, Earth experienced repeated cycles of colder and warmer periods. Massive glaciers expanded and retreated across the northern hemisphere. Sea levels rose and fell dramatically. Forests gave way to open grasslands before returning centuries later. What looked like a permanent homeland to one generation could slowly become far less hospitable to their descendants. Rather than launching heroic expeditions, families may have responded to these changes in surprisingly ordinary ways. Perhaps a nearby valley offered more reliable water after several unusually dry seasons. Maybe migrating herds shifted their routes, encouraging hunters to follow them a little farther than before. A neighboring group might have already settled beyond the next ridge, making unfamiliar territory seem less intimidating. The distance covered during a single lifetime may have been remarkably small. A family moves 10 kilometers. Their children settle another 20 kilometers farther. Their grandchildren continue following familiar animals into new territory. Century after century, these tiny adjustments quietly accumulate. Without anyone intending to cross continents, entire populations gradually begin doing exactly that. It is one of history's greatest paradoxes. No one needed to dream of reaching Europe, Asia, Australia, or the Americas. Those destinations did not even exist as meaningful concepts. What mattered was finding fresh water before the dry season arrived, locating healthy game, avoiding conflict with neighboring groups, and keeping children alive through another winter. The global migration of humanity may have emerged from thousands of local decisions rather than one grand ambition. But if movement happened so gradually, another mystery appears. Why did humans eventually leave Africa at all, when previous human species had struggled to spread successfully across such enormous distances? For decades, researchers debated whether there had been one great migration or many smaller waves. Archaeological discoveries from the Levant, including sites in present-day Israel, suggest that modern humans reached this region during multiple periods, some surprisingly early. Yet not every attempt lasted. Some populations may have disappeared as climates shifted once again, or as they encountered other human species already living there. Leaving Africa, it seems, was not a single triumphant moment. It may have been a story filled with failed journeys that left almost no trace except a handful of ancient bones and scattered stone tools buried beneath layers of sediment. Those forgotten travelers raise an intriguing possibility. Perhaps history remembers only the migrations that succeeded, while countless others quietly vanished without descendants to tell their stories. And that realization opens an even bigger question. If the world beyond Africa was already inhabited by other human relatives, what happened when modern humans finally met them? For thousands of years, the lands beyond Africa were far from empty. Long before modern humans arrived, other members of the human family had already adapted to environments that seemed almost impossible to survive. In Europe, Neanderthals had endured bitter Ice Age winters for hundreds of thousands of years. Across large parts of Asia, another mysterious population known today as the Denisovans occupied mountains, forests, and high plateaus. Elsewhere, other human groups may have existed whose stories have largely disappeared from the archaeological record. This changes the way we imagine migration. Our ancestors were not simply exploring untouched wilderness. In many places, they were entering landscapes where other humans already hunted, gathered food, built shelters, and raised children. The first encounter between two different human species may not have looked dramatic at all. Imagine spotting smoke on the horizon, hearing unfamiliar voices carried by the wind, or discovering footprints that looked almost, but not quite, like your own. The reaction could have been curiosity. It could have been fear. It could have been both. Archaeology cannot tell us what those first conversations sounded like, assuming they happened at all. Stone tools do not preserve emotions. Fossils do not record greetings. But genetic evidence reveals something extraordinary. Modern people living outside Africa still carry small amounts of Neanderthal DNA, while many populations across Asia and Oceania also carry Denisovan DNA. These traces suggest that, at least sometimes, different human groups met peacefully enough to have children together. That discovery transformed our understanding of human history. For generations, many imagined human evolution as a straight line, with one species replacing another in neat succession. Reality appears to have been far messier. The human family resembled a braided river rather than a single path. Different groups separated, adapted independently for thousands of years, met again, exchanged genes, and sometimes disappeared, leaving fragments of themselves inside future generations. In other words, migration was not only about moving across landscapes. It was also about meeting strangers who were, in many ways, distant relatives. Some of these inherited genes may have proved remarkably useful. Researchers have suggested that certain Neanderthal genes influenced immune responses, helping modern humans cope with unfamiliar pathogens encountered outside Africa. Denisovan DNA appears to have contributed to adaptations seen among modern Tibetan populations, allowing many people to live more comfortably at extreme altitudes where oxygen levels are much lower. The journey across the world was therefore more than a geographical challenge. It became a biological exchange that quietly reshaped the future of our species. Yet surviving new environments required much more than inherited genes. Each unfamiliar landscape presented problems no one had solved before. Tropical forests demanded different hunting strategies than open grasslands. Frozen tundra required clothing capable of trapping precious body heat. Mountain passes introduced thin air and dangerous weather. Coastal regions offered fish, shellfish, and seaweed to those willing to experiment with entirely new food sources. Humans responded with something evolution had been refining for hundreds of thousands of years: innovation. Stone tools became increasingly specialized. Spears improved. Clothing likely became better fitted. Fire was used not only for warmth, but also for cooking, preserving food, hardening wooden tools, and extending activity into the night. Every successful adaptation made the next migration slightly less risky. Knowledge spread just as people did. A clever technique invented in one valley could eventually travel hundreds of kilometers through neighboring groups. Even communities that never met directly may have benefited from ideas passed along through countless exchanges over generations. Long before writing existed, information itself had begun migrating across continents. Then archaeology revealed another surprise. For a long time, researchers believed coastlines played only a minor role in early migration. Today, many scholars think the opposite may be true. Ancient shorelines offered an extraordinary combination of predictable food sources: fish, shellfish, crabs, seabirds, edible plants, and fresh water often existed within relatively small areas. Instead of chasing migrating herds across vast plains, some groups may simply have followed the coastline. The difficulty is that most of those ancient campsites now lie beneath the sea. At the height of the last ice age, enormous quantities of Earth's water were locked inside glaciers. Sea levels stood more than 100 meters lower than today. Vast stretches of coastline that once supported human communities disappeared beneath rising oceans as the climate warmed. Entire chapters of human migration may now rest underwater, hidden from archaeologists beneath layers of sediment and coral. It is a humbling thought. Some of humanity's earliest journeys may have left almost no visible evidence because the landscapes themselves no longer exist. Still, clues continue to emerge. Stone tools found along parts of Arabia suggest that greener climates occasionally transformed what is now harsh desert into grasslands filled with lakes and rivers. During these wetter periods, routes that appear impossible today may have become inviting corridors connecting Africa with Eurasia. Migration, therefore, was not merely driven by human determination. It also depended on rare moments when nature quietly opened doors that would later close again. Timing may have mattered as much as courage. A family leaving only a few thousand years earlier, or later, might have encountered an entirely different world. A fertile valley could already have become desert. A narrow land bridge might have disappeared beneath rising seas. A familiar river may have dried into cracked earth. History often celebrates remarkable individuals. But the greatest migration in human history may have depended just as much on fortunate seasons, changing climates, and opportunities that lasted only a geological moment. And nowhere would that fragile timing become more important than at the edge of a continent where a narrow strip of water separated humans from a land no one had ever reached before. By the time our ancestors approached the edge of Southeast Asia, they had already traveled farther than any previous generation could possibly remember. Mountains had risen behind them. Deserts had been crossed. Rivers that once seemed endless had become distant memories. Yet one obstacle remained, unlike anything they had encountered before: the sea. Even during periods when global sea levels were dramatically lower than today, the ocean still formed an enormous barrier between mainland Asia and the continent we now call Australia. Geologists refer to this region as Wallacea, a chain of islands separated by deep channels that never completely disappeared, even at the height of the Ice Age. Unlike many other migration routes, this was not simply a matter of walking farther. At some point, humans had to cross open water. Exactly how they accomplished this remains one of archaeology's most fascinating mysteries. No wooden boats from that distant past have survived, and organic materials rarely endure for tens of thousands of years in tropical environments. Yet archaeological evidence leaves little room for doubt. Modern humans had reached Australia by at least 65,000 years ago, according to discoveries at Majid Baby in northern Australia. That date changes everything. It means our ancestors successfully crossed stretches of ocean long before agriculture, long before cities, and long before written history. They may have used simple rafts built from logs, bundles of reeds, or other natural materials that vanished long ago. Whatever they constructed, it had to carry entire families, children, tools, food, and perhaps even fire across unfamiliar waters. Imagine standing on a beach at dawn. Across the horizon, another island is barely visible through the morning haze. You have no guarantee that it contains fresh water. You do not know whether dangerous animals live there. You cannot be certain that another shoreline even exists beyond the one you can barely see. If the current carries you off course, there is no rescue waiting. And yet, someone decided to launch anyway. This decision reveals something remarkable about the human mind. Curiosity may have become as powerful as necessity. Some researchers suggest that population growth encouraged groups to seek new territories. Others believe environmental pressures played a larger role. Both explanations are possible, but neither fully explains why anyone would intentionally paddle toward an unknown horizon. Perhaps the answer lies in something deeply human. Our species does not simply react to the world. We imagine worlds that exist beyond what we can currently see. That ability, to picture possibilities before experiencing them, may have transformed migration from slow expansion into genuine exploration. Once people reached Australia, they encountered landscapes unlike anything their ancestors had known. Towering eucalyptus forests, unfamiliar marsupials, giant reptiles, and birds that could not fly became part of daily life. They adapted once again, learning new hunting techniques, discovering edible plants, and developing knowledge suited specifically to this vast southern continent. But Australia was not the final destination. Far to the north, another enormous landmass waited: Europe. Compared with tropical regions, Europe presented an entirely different challenge. Winters could be brutally cold. Snow covered the landscape for months. Daylight became scarce. Large Ice Age mammals such as mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, reindeer, and bison dominated many environments. Here, survival depended not only on intelligence, but also on preparation. Archaeological discoveries reveal increasingly sophisticated stone technologies during this period. Bone needles suggest that carefully tailored clothing may have become essential for enduring freezing temperatures. Shelters grew more effective. Fire became even more valuable, offering warmth, light, protection, and a place where stories could be shared after dark. Those stories may have mattered more than we realize. Knowledge accumulated over generations became humanity's invisible survival kit. A child born into one community inherited thousands of years of practical experience without needing to rediscover it personally. Which animals migrated first in spring? Which caves flooded after heavy rain? Which berries remained safe after frost? Every lesson remembered increased the chances that another generation would continue moving forward. Culture itself had become a migration technology. Then something unexpected happened. As glaciers expanded during the last glacial maximum, enormous quantities of water became trapped in ice sheets. Sea levels dropped dramatically, exposing land that no longer exists today. One of these lost landscapes connected Siberia and Alaska. We know it as Beringia. Far from being a narrow bridge, Beringia was at times an immense region of grassland supporting mammoths, horses, bison, and countless other animals. For generations, human groups may have lived there rather than simply passing through. What appears on modern maps as a crossing between continents may actually have been a homeland where families hunted, raised children, and adapted to an environment unlike any other. Eventually, some groups continued eastward. Exactly when and how they entered the Americas remains one of archaeology's most actively debated questions. For much of the 20th century, many researchers believed people arrived only after an ice-free corridor opened between massive glaciers. Today, discoveries from several archaeological sites suggest the story may be more complicated. Some scholars argue that people reached the Americas earlier, perhaps traveling along the Pacific coastline where marine resources could support long-distance movement. The debate continues because evidence is still emerging. Each newly excavated site has the potential to reshape our understanding of one of humanity's final great migrations. What seems increasingly clear, however, is that the journey into the Americas was not the last chapter of exploration. Even after humans reached nearly every major continent, the instinct to keep moving never truly disappeared. And that raises an even deeper question. If our ancestors had finally spread across the world, why did they never stop searching for what lay beyond the next horizon? Even after humans had reached Africa, Europe, Asia, Australia, and eventually the Americas, the story of migration did not simply end. There was no final destination marked by a line across a map. No generation gathered together and declared that the world had finally been explored. Instead, movement continued, because the forces that had always driven migration never truly disappeared. Children were still being born. Rivers still changed their courses. Animals still altered their migration routes. The climate still refused to remain the same. The habits that had carried our ancestors across continents became woven into the fabric of human life itself. One of the most remarkable examples can be found far out in the Pacific Ocean. Unlike Australia, reaching the remote islands of Polynesia required journeys across thousands of kilometers of open ocean. These voyages happened much later than the migrations of the Ice Age, but they reveal something profound about human nature. Ancient navigators crossed enormous stretches of water without compasses, modern maps, or metal ships. Instead, they learned to read the stars, the rhythm of ocean swells, the direction of seasonal winds, the flight patterns of seabirds, and even the subtle reflections of distant islands hidden beyond the horizon. Their knowledge was so sophisticated that many European explorers initially struggled to believe it. Yet archaeological discoveries, linguistic evidence, and genetic studies all point toward one extraordinary conclusion. Human beings had become experts at turning knowledge into movement. The greatest migration technology was never the boat. It was the human brain. This realization changes how we think about our ancestors. For centuries, prehistoric people were often portrayed as primitive wanderers drifting aimlessly through dangerous landscapes. Modern archaeology paints a very different picture. These were skilled observers of nature. They understood seasonal cycles, animal behavior, edible plants, weather patterns, and landscapes with astonishing detail. Their survival depended on making thousands of correct decisions, many of which appear almost invisible to us today. Knowing where to find fresh water after several dry months. Recognizing which clouds predicted heavy rain. Understanding how rivers changed after winter snow melted. Remembering where particular stone could be collected to produce stronger tools. Every piece of knowledge increased the chances that another family would survive long enough to continue the journey. And perhaps that is why migration succeeded where so many other species struggled. Humans did not need stronger muscles than mammoths. They did not run faster than wolves. They could not fly over mountains like birds. Instead, they carried something far more powerful: shared memory. Every generation inherited discoveries made by countless people they would never meet. A child learning to shape a stone blade was unknowingly benefiting from innovations stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. A young hunter, following experienced elders, inherited knowledge gathered across thousands of successful hunts. A family crossing unfamiliar valleys carried not only tools, but also stories. Stories about dangerous animals. Stories about reliable rivers. Stories about distant mountains. Stories about places where food could always be found after difficult winters. Those stories became invisible maps. Long before written language existed, humanity had already built perhaps the largest library in the natural world. It simply existed inside people instead of on paper. Yet there is another lesson hidden inside this extraordinary journey. Migration was rarely a straight line toward progress. Groups sometimes disappeared. Entire populations may have reached new regions only to vanish after climates changed once again. Coastlines that once welcomed travelers now rest beneath the sea. Ancient camps remain buried under deserts that were once covered by lakes and grasslands. Much of humanity's greatest adventure has literally been erased by time. Every archaeological discovery, therefore, represents only a surviving fragment of an immense story. A single stone tool, a footprint preserved in ancient mud, a campfire buried beneath layers of sediment, a child's tooth hidden inside a cave. Each discovery is like finding a single page from a book whose remaining chapters have long since disappeared. That is why our understanding of migration continues to evolve. New dating techniques improve every year. Ancient DNA reveals relationships that fossils alone could never explain. Underwater archaeology is beginning to explore landscapes drowned by rising seas after the Ice Age. Researchers continue to debate important questions, and every new excavation has the potential to rewrite chapters that once seemed settled. Ironically, the story of migration is still migrating. Our understanding keeps moving forward. And perhaps that is the most human characteristic of all. We continue searching. Not because every mystery can be solved, but because curiosity refuses to stay still. If you return, in your imagination, to that cold morning where this journey began, you can almost hear the same sounds once again. The wind moves softly through unfamiliar grass. A distant bird calls across an empty valley. Smoke rises from a dying fire. A family gathers what little they own before taking another uncertain step. None of them knows they are leaving one continent. None of them imagines that their descendants will one day live beneath Arctic skies, inside tropical rainforests, across vast deserts, on isolated islands, and among mountains so high that clouds drift beneath their feet. They are not trying to conquer the world. They are simply trying to survive another season. Yet, one careful decision after another, one river after another, one generation after another, they accomplish something no other species has ever achieved. They transform an entire planet into their home. Perhaps that is the greatest paradox of human migration. The people who changed the world almost certainly never believed they were changing it at all. And maybe that is how history often unfolds. Not through a single extraordinary moment that everyone remembers, but through millions of ordinary footsteps that, together, quietly carried humanity